Hello, my name is Robert Walker. I am an accountant and an insolvency practitioner. This is the sixth instalment in my series on the subject of managing insolvency in troubled times. I rather grandly titled this session Axiom of Restructuring. Now, what I want to do is I want to introduce an idea. At this early stage I want to do so because I want to acclimatise people to what appears to be a radical idea. I will be talking in more detail about the practicalities of what I am suggesting, so if the matter is theoretical or philosophical or of not any great interest, then I suggest you skip this session. However, I hope most people will find it interesting. Now, the idea on its face appears to be very radical, but it's radical only in the sense that Martin Luther's criticism of the Catholic Church, for example, was radical. Martin Luther introduced the Reformation, of course. Martin Luther was not a radical, he was a deep conservative. What he was doing was hankering after a bygone age of the Catholic Church, far back into the past from the contemporary church, and that's what he wanted. So you should see what I am about to say in that context. I'm as radical as Martin Luther. Now, when we talk about restructuring, we think of debt as having perhaps two dimensions to it that can be changed in a restructure. One is that the sum payable can be reduced, by contract of course or by agreement, or alternatively the period of time over which it extends can be extended. Both of those two things can happen together, of course, and that is what people would think of as being a debt restructure. Now, that brings me to the subject of debt itself, or liabilities, as you may recall that I think of it from the point of view of the debtor. And when I began this series, it made me think back to 10 or more years ago, to the last financial crisis we had, the last recession, which began in about 2007. About that time I began to think that the problem, the flaw in the system, was debt itself. Now, about that same time I was beginning to, for personal interest, to look into the origins of my own discipline, being accounting. And what I found was that accounting, if not had its origins in the golden age of Islam was certainly a bridge between the modern Europe and its origins, and it travelled, the idea of accounting travelled across the Middle East to the Levant and then from there into early modern Italy, as it happens. But as I was searching for the origins, I encountered Islam, and I encountered, of course, the principal figure in Islam being Muhammad. And I discovered, perhaps I knew this but had never thought about it very much, that Muhammad was sceptical about debt as well, or interest and debt, perhaps we should say. Now, let's not forget that Muhammad, for more of his life, was a businessman and part-time jurist, such as jurists they had in the society in which he lived, before he was a prophet, and he spent more of his life doing that than being a prophet. However, what you will find that I think that those are the ideas that he got, that are represented in the Quran, which may be somewhat heretical for me to say, in actual fact lay in his brain. And the passage I'm thinking of is short, and it says this: "Trade is like usury, but Allah permits trade but forbids it usury." Now be careful with the word usury. It's not now a direct analogue to the Arabic word riba. Riba means lending at interest, and usury means lending at excessive interest. However, if you go back into the etymology of the word usury, you will find that it really means lending at interest. So substitute lending at interest into the quotation I just made, and you will see that it makes quite a big difference. The word usury has gone through a semantic shift, and we will look at the reasons why that happened. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that this idea that is present in Islam is foreign to the other main Abrahamic faiths, being Christianity and Judaism. It was there in Christianity in its early days, hence what I said about Martin Luther, and it was there in an even earlier stage in Judaism. the prohibition on interest, and therefore debt. Now, I think that the semantic shift in the meaning of the word usury accompanies a fundamental societal change in Western society, which is that the Western society accepted the idea of banking. So it could hardly be the case that its principal religion banned the activity of banking, which is taking in monies as deposits and lending at interest. So the word usury narrowed down to mean lending at excessive interest. So that accounts for the semantic shift, and Arabic stays the same because it is a principle that was not inviolable in the Islamic tradition. However, why were these early Abrahamic faiths so against interest? Now, I think there is a deep theoretical, philosophical reason for that. We won't go into that. Why do I think that Muhammad was hostile to the notion of lending at interest? And I think that's for an entirely practical reason. What you need to understand about Muhammad is where he lived. He lived in Mecca. Now, there's not a lot at Mecca. Now there's an important religious site, and there was a shrine there before Islam. But primarily, Mecca had a little bit of agriculture, but was mainly a trading post. It seems a bit unlikely, but Mecca was a place through which trade to the eastern and southern Mediterranean flowed down through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. And that happened for thousands of years. Okay, so Muhammad was a participant in this society, and I think that he watched people borrowing money from bankers, the fellow tribesmen in Mecca, and then trading with that by sailing away and then coming back and paying the debt off. Now, what would happen if a merchant fell on bad luck and lost his consignment or his cargo to piracy or storm or whatever? He would still owe the banker. The bankers would then take the residue of his property, and he'd be condemned to a slow death by starvation or slavery. And Muhammad, given the nature of the man as a fair-minded man and a jurist, he didn't like that idea. I truly believe that the reason that Muhammad was driven from Mecca to Medina wasn't because he had a notion of a unified God. I think he was driven away because he was hostile to the interests of the bankers. I may be wrong about that, but it seems likely to me. So, what model of business did Muhammad favour? Muhammad favoured what in an Italian word, from somewhat later, is the Commenda model. Now, what is a Commenda? A Commenda, in actual fact, probably describes a semi-insurance arrangement. And what's happening is there's a funder who contributes a pool of money to the merchant, who takes the money and travels with it and hopefully converts it into goods from which they can make a profit. And if they do, the participant, the funder in the Commenda, takes their share of the profit and everybody's happy. However, as you will notice, that if there is piracy or storm and the merchant is unlucky, the funder in the Commenda is subject to the same risk. Hence there's an element of insurance in it. So it's a risk-sharing model of funding a business entity. And this is to be contrasted with the model that grew up at about the time that Venice became the centre of the financial world and the trade world, and the bankers became prominent at that time, right? And you can see the idea, if you're sufficiently well informed about Shakespeare and the Merchant of Venice, that the lender, Shylock, does not have an exact commonality of interest with the merchant who lost his cargo and was then vulnerable to the repayment, which was the pound of flesh. So from that point in time, our system is not only dominated by debt and interest, it is the system. You don't need to know too much about financial economics to know the notions of debt and interest is absolutely central to it. It is the fundamental axiom of it. And I have a degree of scepticism about it quite clearly. Now, I'm not saying that my proposition that the Commenda model is better is without problem. I think you will find that economic theorists would tell you that having a fixed sum of money payable with a fixed return to the funder eliminates the uncertainty for the funder, the banker, because they don't have to worry about what the profit really was. In other words, they avoid the problem of audit. In other words, certainty comes to the operation, to the function of banking, a certainty of sorts. What I would tell you is that that certainty is an illusion as it happens. Now, not the last recession, but the recession before that, I experienced this firsthand. I was the accountant for quite a large bank. The certainty of the debts that the consumer was going to collect was false. Those debts turned bad and the bank failed and had to be propped up by the government. So I had personal experience of the illusion of certainty that basic fundamental debt lending at interest appears to give you. So what I would prefer, of course, is the Commenda model to prevail in our modern economies. Now, this isn't my idea. I didn't dream it up. I got it from somewhere else. And the most prominent proponent of the idea was a man called Varoufakis, who you may recall was the Greek finance minister when Greece was negotiating with the European Union after it had basically become insolvent. And what he wanted to do is he wanted lenders to sovereign entities, being large-scale banks, to governments, to be rewarded for their funding as and when the economy ebbs and flows, right? So if it's doing well, they get more money. If it's not doing as well, they get less. In other words, the interest of the lenders would be exactly aligned with the interest of the people. And I think he has a point. The alignment of the interests of the funders and the investors in a business is a way to promote harmony. What does this lead me to? Well, what it leads me to is the proposition that instead of restructuring by reducing the amount or prolonging the term, that another way of achieving it is to substitute shares or an equity investment for the debt. Now, that might sound radical, but as you'll see, it's not. Now, I know that New Zealand businessmen are very obsessively secret about their companies. They don't want anybody to see what goes on. Clearly, if you have one or more outside investors, external parties, your privacy is gone. But it's a small price to pay for survival, I say. What I think I'm actually really saying is that the Marxist model of this eternal war between suppliers and capital providers, and I'm thinking of labour here because they're a form of supply, is false. That there's no reason why employees shouldn't have shares, there is no reason why suppliers should not have shares, and to me it makes perfect sense. And it may not make sense all of the time, but it certainly makes sense in this context, that it's much easier for the debts to be converted for a period of time into shares. I will explain how the involuntary investors would exit from it at a later date, but just believe me, it is possible. Now, where perhaps an unusual element of this might arise is that I think that this should not only apply to suppliers, private sector people, employees. I think it should apply to the Crown. Now, the Crown, you will find through this looming recession, will have a vast amount of debt by way of taxation that will not be able to be paid. I think that it would be sensible for the Crown, even if it has to change the law to do it, to convert all of those claims in debt, those liabilities of the relevant enterprises, to convert it into an equity stake for the duration of the recession. I think that makes perfect sense. There is no reason why that is not practicable. After all, remember what I said about the bank I worked for, it was funded by the Crown. That's what happened in the last recession. Large businesses were bailed out by their respective governments, whether it was in Europe or Britain or the United States. Why is it? What is qualitatively different about a large enterprise versus the mass of small to medium-sized businesses? There is no difference, and the same rules should apply. That's my view. So that brings me to the point where I'll tell you what I'm proposing is ho-hum, it's routine. You will find that if you look at the seminal case in How You Run a Compromise, which was from 2013, it was the Bank of Tokyo contesting with Solid Energy, and Justice Winkleman, who, as she was then, she's now not a mere justice, she's the Chief Justice, she said, when confronted with a complaint about Bank of Tokyo having debt forced upon it, equity forced upon it for its debt, she said, and they tried to say that's not possible with a simple compromise, she said, where does it say that? It doesn't. It's perfectly sensible. This is routine. Get on with it. So, you see, my theory isn't as radical as I say it is. What might be a little bit more radical, of course, is that I'm suggesting that we need to change our economic model completely. We need to eliminate the notion of debt, and we need to understand that business interests across time are aligned much better when everybody rises and falls with the same tide. So I think that over time we might reconsider the way we do business. That might be a radical thought. Please, if you wish for written material, look below the video and you will find ways to acquire it. Thank you very much. Bye.